Thank you all. I hope you can hear me. All right. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today about sharing some high-level thoughts that I have on some work that I have been doing while I'm on sabbatical linked to organizational disparities. In light of recent unrest on many college campuses, you might just imagine the types of emails and phone calls that I receive as it relates to this type of work and how it might be useful to institutional leaders. And I have been wrestling with how to best explain what we know from an empirical perspective, as well as how we have been going about our practice as it relates to diversity on our college campuses, to be able to communicate the type of direction that would be useful to institutional leaders, as well as those that find it to be very important to cultivate the types of welcoming environments that you would imagine that organizations built on intellectual inquiry might have. And then if time permits, I will also talk some about the work that is going on in my research laboratory, some of the major projects, and then also, if time permits, I share some thinking that I have in the work that I'm doing on sabbatical as I spend time at Duke, learning the traditions of decision sciences. Now, I say all that to say I don't know if I'm going to make it through everything I want to say to talk about those things, but if time does permit, during the rest of my visit, I'm happy to talk about those other elements too that I've been spending time on. So, what would you say if I told you that most institutions of higher education have found important ways to integrate diversity to compete at the highest level? Would you believe me? That's what I expected, right? So let me show you something. So at the turn of the century, these pictures depict competing at the various highest levels, right? There's pictures, Chicago, Michigan, and we got a Harvard one thrown in there as well. But I want to talk a little bit in this next set of pictures about broadening our institutional mission for highly desirable talent. And the first set of pictures were the national champions in football at the turn of the century. And the composition looks quite different than what we see now. Right? So it is not uncharted territory that institutions can change how they view the capabilities of diverse groups when it comes to competing at the highest level, right? And these pictures are not to suggest that there weren't questions and still aren't questions now about what diverse groups are able to do, even when we see these diverse pictures, right? Some of you might be saying, well, there was questions about who could play quarterback and who can do all these different things in sports, right? But now you see the quarterback position looks a lot different. Then for those of you that are really astute to what's going on in athletics, you'll say, well, but we got a lot of questions about the hiring practices over there. And we recognize there's a great deal of diversity on the field, but in other places, there's a lot of work left to do. And that is very true. And hopefully, I'm able to talk about one of those, or a couple of projects that we have that does deal with that. Now, let's leave this part of our college campus and let's start to walk to the main campuses from wherever it is. And let's just look at the pictures that show up in our college media guides that represent how we think about our institutions. And then you start to see pictures that look like this. You see pictures that begin to represent a college existence that might not look as diverse as you would see in the other pictures. You might also find that some institutions, one that I work at, got themselves in a good bit of trouble about maybe 17 years ago, where they doctored photos that were in the college media guides, and they had photoshopped in a gentleman that was not at an event, but put him in there because they wanted diversity at the event, and the gentleman saw that, and it just happened to be the event that the Michigan game, if many of you follow this, and the stadium crumbled and people got injured, and there was a lot of hurt feelings, and people didn't want to be associated with the event and certain things. And what the photo that they happened to choose a photo of a gentleman that was a part of not wanting to be associated with it, and put it in there and created a major stink, and individuals have since had to find other jobs. But when we represent our college campuses through these media guides for recruitment purposes, you know, oftentimes the messaging looks a little different. So it leads us to better understand the types of disparities that we do see on general campus. And these disparities have been documented. So if we look at the enrollment, if we go to the data that's available to us from the National Center for Educational Statistics, and we look at the from 1990 to 2013, you know, we'll see that there has been some progress, right, for diverse and underrepresented groups, but the disparities among groups still exist, suggesting that there's still a good bit of work for us to do on our college campuses to ensure that students leave these campuses with the capability to have interacted in a meaningful way with diverse groups that they will see in the workplace. And you'll see similar results when you look at the postgraduate or graduate school enrollment, where yes, there is progress occurring, but the disparities do still exist, right? And so when you look at these enrollments, it has significant impact on a number of life outcomes, right? So if you think about the role and the value of a college education on earning outcomes, where one may be able to live, decision making, right? These are very important life realities linked to enrollments in higher education. The same is true for postgraduate, right? There are certain desirable jobs in our society that require postgraduate training. And when that postgraduate training is not available, then the inequities that we might see currently in our broad society may continue to be there. And then when you start to look at what oftentimes is referred to as the core of institutions of higher learning, and you start to look at the faculty, and you think about the role that faculty play, right? The in-classroom interaction, the capability to mentor, the shaping or perpetuation of organizational culture. Right? It's critical to think, what are we doing there, and how well might we be diversifying the faculty range? Because oftentimes that core stays in place, and it shapes a lot. It has significant implications around the overall composition of our institutions and how we value and what we see. And you can see here that, to the extent that you can make this out, actually, that the by race, ethnicity, the number and percentage of those that find themselves in these faculty roles is not that high. And then there's a gender element and component that's playing out here as well, as you can see, where we do understand that by race and gender and other types of differences, that the representations aren't always there. I've argued for quite some time that sometimes we stop our discussion there, even if we get to the diversification of faculty. Oftentimes institutions spend most of their time primarily talking about diversifying student population. And then when we do get to talking about faculty, oftentimes we end the discussion, and I've argued that we really needed to have a three-tier approach to thinking and understanding our institutional diversity, and understanding the interrelated connectivity between the students, the faculty, and those that develop leadership policies and carry those out at our institutions. And in doing that, it is very clear that in order to address the first couple of charts on undergraduate enrollment and postgraduate enrollment, that we have a lot of work still to do. Diversifying those that have access to institutions of higher education, and then particularly those that are finding interest in certain fields that are of value. But faculty play a very central role in where students find it attractive to go, right? Particularly when we think about graduate school. And if you start to think about graduate school and you look at how you come about selecting those programs and deciding who you want to work with, perhaps you go somewhere that no one studies what you want to study, but oftentimes you try to go to places that study the areas that you're interested in. And then at the same time, we're increasingly learning that students are also finding it of value and interest to also study with those that have some similar characteristics to them, right? So when you look at some unique programs like computer science, math, and others that have these interesting places that do very well, like Florida and computer science, Iowa and math. Then you start looking at the composition of the faculty and you say, oh, it's an unusually diverse faculty, which is helping attract an unusually diverse student population. Also, when you think about the role that administrative leaders play in shaping policy and dialogue at our institutions and being responsive to challenges, particularly like the ones we currently see, we also need diverse voices and representation in those spaces as well. And when we think about the totality of diversifying and attracting good talent to our institutions, highly informed professionals do want to be cognizant of who they're working with. So who's in the leadership is very important when you think about what type of faculty roles you may want to be at, and what leadership roles you might consider is also of interest to know who's on the faculty that you might be able to rely on for their expertise and support and roles, and then students as well. So when we do look at administrative diversity in the various contexts, we aren't doing much better there than we were doing in the other areas, right? If you can make out this figure here, which you might not be able to, it shows the distribution by race of provosts across the United States, right? We're 60%, 66% white. And these are the breakdown of the other groups. And then you can see by institution type, it's a 2-year institution, it's majority female, 4-year institution, majority male, and the gap is a little larger there. And we're not doing much better when we start looking at college presidents either, right? There has been progress, for sure, but by and large, these are still spaces where we don't have a whole lot of diversity in place. So my own work has really was spent in looking at these workplace challenges in higher education, really trying to gauge what's going on, but also how we might be responsive into these spaces. And my initial inquiries were certainly trying to understand upward mobility challenges or hiring and promotional dynamics, moving through the ranks on the academic leadership side. And what I mean by academic leadership, I'm referring to the leadership roles that are generally reserved for those that are concurrently faculty, right? So they're deans, they're provosts, they're presidents. And most of the key decision-making roles that we have at our institutions usually come through that trajectory, not exclusively, but usually. But then I've also been intrigued with exploring the experiences for in student affairs, which happens to be, of the administrative ranks that we have in higher education, the most diverse, right? That's where you would see more diversity in the co-curricular leadership of most of our institutions. And I've been able to get some funding to also make sense of this across an engagement, retention, and advancement set of thought processes where we think of the recruitment and retention of administrators in ways that we do these other populations, right? So what does it mean to properly retain an administrator? It's not normally part of our lexicon. We think about, we want to make sure that students stay until they graduate, right? And then ideally you want faculty to move through the ranks. But what's the appropriate lifespan of an academic leader, right? Do you want a college president for 40 years? Maybe. Is it a bad thing that you create a work environment that cultivates success for one of your academic leaders to become the provost at another institution? Is that failure or is that success, right? And that culminated in this model that really lays out for institutions to think about what type of work they should be considering and engaging in even prior to search processes or thinking about target strategies, right? That there's a lot of work that institutions can be doing even well before you seek to introduce opportunities. And a good bit of it has to do with becoming very involved and committed to the various communities from which these individuals will come from, and to think about the orientation, types of processes, what types of strategic opportunities could be in play there, and then also spending some time disentangling what we've learned to be desirable work conditions, right? There is a general premise out there that salary drives the, predominant decision making, but what we found is that, there are a number and host of other factors that are very important to professionals who really have some career goals and objectives. So for about 10 or 12 years of doing this work, I was operating under some serious assumptive positions, right? That one of the major assumptions that I had, no one in here would make this assumption, but I had this assumption that because most of the work that I was doing was at predominantly white institutions, that we were finding all these experiences, that if you reversed it and you studied predominantly black institutions and you looked at white professionals, that the experiences would translate, that it would just be the same types of experiences, just in a different context. So I did this study where it was based around kind of a challenge around organizational culture, right? So most of the theories we have and concepts we have about organizational culture are in a predominantly white context. And so here we are, we want to look at a predominantly black institution and we want to see, does this hold true? And we were able to get some unique data where we collected information from white student affairs professionals that worked at historically black college and universities, right? And again, we had these assumptions that it would kind of come out the same. And just of interest, what we actually found was nothing like what I had anticipated. I assumed that there would be challenges associated with developing good workplace relationships, long-term collegial relationships, all these things that we see in the literature, the not valuing one's professional position, concern with real authority and decision making. Didn't find any of that. We found one negative thing that came up. And the one negative item that came up had nothing to do with what was going on in the workplace. These individuals got teased when they were off work with family and friends. They got teased for working at the black institution. Not at work, but in their personal lives, right? So we drew a linkage to the literature that talks about men working in female dominated spaces, and there's a body of work in nursing that talks about how males enjoy a lot of professional advantages in the workplace. As nurses, they take the leadership roles, the higher pay, but get teased, right, when they're with their family and their friends. And so that was one that was of interest. Wasn't expecting that. And then this book, which I've shared, I think that may be coming to some of you in your courses, where there was no real comprehensive treatment of trying to understand these experiences and dynamics and how one fits within this workforce that has at the core of it, right? This is an evidence-based society. Everything is evaluated, critiqued, and there's a certain way you go about the work that you do. And in this text, what we did was pull together all of what we could find from a data standpoint to better understand how we study these types of topics. What frameworks are most relevant when you think about employment disparities? And then this other text, which was also shared, is coming out of about a 10-year project where I was studying glass ceiling effects, where really intrigued with this notion of, do we have glass ceiling effects, right? So we read all the time that there's glass ceiling effects in the Chronicle and all these other places. And but the question is, are these is this the glass ceiling, or is this gender inequities that just continue and perpetuate from entry-level positions to senior-level positions, right? And so to empirically demonstrate that you do have a glass ceiling, you have to show that over time, as one moves up the professional accession, that their probability of selection is significantly decreased. Now, how many studies like that have you read? Well, a part of the challenge is one that we've largely used it as a shock term in higher ed. The second is that we have data limitations. Our national data that we have on higher ed professionals are largely cross-sectional. Right? We don't have the type of longitudinal data that's necessary to do this. But institutions do, right? So this text is actually a resource to institutional researchers arguing that in the toolkit of analyses that we receive on an annual basis from our fact data books that we see on these campuses, that we ought to be taking a closer look at whether there's some glass ceiling effects in play in our workplace, so that we can be better responsive when we're doing gender equity or race equity reviews around salary, pay, promotion, and some other key elements that we deal with in higher education, that we actually do have access to data that could inform that type of a discussion if we elected to do so. So some interesting outcomes from some of this work that I'll share. The first is around some of the global dynamics. I had a wonderful discussion earlier today. So I took the data that we have from a national perspective and looked at data that's available in the UK of general curiosity of how do we fare in the US as you might see in other countries. And in the UK, you'll find that as far as race ethnicity comes into play, that in the US, we have about 10% of those in leadership roles, and then in the UK, it's about 12.6%. And in both cases, you'll see that there is a gender dynamic in place, which a larger gap that you'll see in the U.S., but also one still in the U.K., but not quite as large as you'll see in the United States. And then lastly, in both contexts, those staff support roles that are very critical and central to our operations, they're largely populated by women in both contexts. So we also looked at the data by gender, and in looking at these data by gender, we found something interesting across both data sets. And I should note that the academic leadership data set came from the National Study of Post-Secondary Faculty that's collected by the National Center for Education Statistics. But then on the student affairs side, the data come from the NASPA association that's linked to their survey, their salary survey. And when you look across both data sets, we began to find something interesting around gender when you looked across the years. And if you, in looking at the data here linked to the student affairs data set, you see that there's a gender that it is opposite of what you have historically hear about the leadership roles, in the sense that for all groups except for the white non-Hispanic group, the majority were women in the leadership roles. And then when you looked at the academic leadership side, there was one group where you found that to be the case, and that was for African Americans and blacks. The other potential area of interest was location. So we also took the distribution of leaders by institution and placed them in region of the country, and found that location does matter. This map is just an illustration. We ran the data on both data sets. But what we found was that when you plot this, what you would naturally think of as the larger populations by region of the country was quite reflective of what you found in those institutions. Now, why this is of critical interest is this whole new movement around strategic diversity planning and the growth of chief diversity officers, based on the premise that if you do not have a strategy in place to cultivate the type of composition you find desirable at your institution, naturally what will occur will be very similar to your general surrounding, right? So if you seek to disrupt or desire to have a higher level of diversity that's just naturally available to your surrounding area, you have to have some type of plan in place to do that. And without that type of plan, it's just not going to naturally occur. So some of the workplace experience I think are important to talk about and think through. Also includes just recognizing that the barriers that are communicated when you are collecting qualitative data for leaders of color and also women, and they talk about the higher education being a pretty complex work environment. And I think that's pretty fair to say that it's a very complicated industry for everyone, right? That understanding movement and trajectories through promotion and tenure and the various other types of measured ways we think about our work, that's a pretty challenging feat regardless. And sometimes it's done with ambiguous expectations. So what you find is the wrestling with certain challenges, working in these spaces where you have race and gender at play in the workplace, right? There are some realities that are hard to escape, and that these realities are linked to certain dynamics, right? So higher education, these wonderful institutions of higher education, they sit within our broader social context. And so some are the social challenges and unrest and realities that are operating outside the walls of the academy, those attitudes find their way into the academy as well. So it's hard to escape those belief systems that come in to the academy to shape that. Also, we have some real organizational dynamics that we have to work on, right? I mean, these are some institutions that have some value systems, structures, and cultures that aren't that responsive to those that come with diverse backgrounds or those that you desire to add to the institution, but never think about how you change the institution by adding different groups. And then this last one I'm going to say a little more about shortly. These individual barriers, these internal dynamics and challenges, they often go unattended to, addressed, or concerned. And these are some of the dynamics that you live with, right? You live with these internal challenges and barriers. And it's this combination of the organizational barriers plus the internal ones which shape your workplace experience, right? And so just to touch on these internal barriers, because we often don't talk about this, but when you have an environment like the academy, you have individuals dealing with fear, they're dealing with low self-esteem, they're dealing with, right, imposter syndrome. We hear this language. We also have concepts out there like racial battle fatigue to help explain, faculty of color at predominantly white institution. Like, just think about that word, right? That someone drew an analog between going to war in a foreign country to working in these institutions, and that there are unknown psychological and physical challenges that could remain for life by virtue of the types of environments that they find themselves working in, right? And so if any of this is remotely representative of what some individuals in these workplaces are dealing with, we are inadequately structured to observe and be supportive to some of these internal barriers and dynamics, right? So it leads us to have incomplete information around understanding why groups exit voluntarily higher education or involuntarily exit the academy. So how do we generally understand these disparities from a research perspective? So whether you're studying hiring practices, upward mobility, glass ceiling effects, race segregation, we tend to model these in very similar ways. In modeling hiring and promotion, we tend to lean quite heavily on understanding how we can model this, and it has these accruable assets that are linked around human and social capital, and then we also have control variables in place to understand these institutional metrics. And this is generally how we think about the hiring process, right? We count widgets for the most part, right? We count widgets, production, accrued assets. So how does this translate to practice? They become programs and initiatives that prepare individuals for institutional readiness for the most part, right? That we tend to do our programming that addresses the same accruable assets, right? And there's good resources out there now to guide institutions to think about this type of work. I'll speed up. How much time do I have?
5 to 8
minutes. Okay, I'm almost done. So there are some good resources out there now. A good colleague of mine, Damon Williams, prepared 2 really good books to help institutions think both about strategic diversity leadership and how one goes about that, and this chief diversity officer role, which is increasingly becoming one of the strategies by which institutions are going about doing this work. And you might have read the recent report released by the president of Johns Hopkins that talks about their inclusion strategy. And about 3 years ago, my team and I, we did a diversity audit and asset inventory for Iowa State University, where we did this year-long comprehensive study to understand the institution's readiness to make changes in that space. And it came at the request of the incoming president that wanted to make some significant investments in this space, but wanted it to be sure that the resources were going in the right place and that there was some empirical direction there. But this is what normally occurs, right? You're seeing these chief diversity officer roles. You have diversity plans, and we have targeted hiring opportunities where if you find a person of great desire to hire, there's a pot of money available to do that. And then there's there's visiting opportunities for both the candidate to think about if they like the place, and you can think about if you like the candidate, right? Try them out. Diversity, postdoctoral elements as well, pre-college programs, summer experiences. But for the most part, the ownership is largely on individuals to get engaged in these processes to accrue the types of experiences and assets that is deemed to be desirable in the places that they want to be. So now we're back to accruable individual assets. So I want to talk a little bit about shifting responsibility on this organizational disparities dynamic. So I was invited by Bill Tierney maybe 6 years ago to write something for the Handbook for Higher Education. And these entries are supposed to be like messaging to the field of where the field should be and where it's just going. And I was heavily into the work on glass ceiling effects, and then really became intrigued with social closure theory and the values of where we can learn from organizations and our decision making in this particular space. And what social closure theory does is gives us this particular lens to not necessarily think about the observed disparities in ways that we currently do, but think about it in ways that that fit a more modern narrative, right, of exclusion. And I think the more modern narrative is that it's not unusual to think that groups are protecting opportunities for individuals in that group, and oftentimes not cognizant that the default is that you discriminate against those not in your group, right? But you didn't wake up that morning saying, I'm going to discriminate against everybody not in this group. You thought about, I want to make sure that everybody that wants to sit in this front row have the capabilities to sit in this front row. So I'm going to go early, and I'm going to sit something in all these rows and then determine who gets to sit up here. Well, unfortunately, what tends to happen is, in these cases, you generally sort diverse groups or non-members into less desirable opportunities, right? So when you plot that over the employment distribution across higher education, that means that you likely see women and people of color in some of the lesser prestigious institutions out there, and oftentimes maybe not in tenure track positions. So it begs the question of shifting of the types of ownership and who is best positioned to be responsive. And then it begs this question, who's best suited? The individuals that are subjected to these disparities, or key leaders in the organizations that create the environment for potential perpetuation of the current realities or confronting opportunities for success. And so it invites organizations to think, what is it about our organizational culture, structure, our value system, and how we go about determining those accruable assets, what value should go to them or not. And it also clarifies that our current strategy really places almost all of the responsibility on the individuals to understand what it takes to be successful in the desired environments they want to be in, accrue the type of assets, whether it's networks, certain degrees, production, to have opportunity and to do well in those spaces. And I'll touch on these two quickly. Ultimately, this work here argues that this is insufficient. It's insufficient for us to advance our understanding of the types of discrimination that goes on in our organizations, purely looking at the human capital or status attainment framework. You know, it also argues that it does not hold institutions accountable for the creation of the environments and hierarchies that does perpetuate these types of dynamics. So one other point before I go on and close, going back to these tables, which I know you cannot read, when you look at the coefficients, the organizational coefficients, they're larger than the individual coefficients. And it begins to help put a context to this notion that we call fit, that the organization plays a very big role in one's individual success. You know, if you find yourself highly capable with a particular skill set and environment that doesn't value it, you will not realize the types of professional outcomes you thought you might if you were in a different type of environment. The same is true for helping to think through the role that the organization can play in this metric. And it argues for an organizational shift. So as I was trying to and continuing to try to understand a way to explain this, so the premise here is that our current lens on these organizational disparities is to invest heavily in individually accruable assets, right? And when you invest heavily in individual accruable assets, what you have is the types of success that we see now. You will have certain individuals that have the capability to figure out how to navigate these organizations. Until the lens gets shifted or inverted, right, an inverted view, to how organizations can think about restructuring to create environments where whole groups can be successful because your evaluative metrics, your value system has helped to adjust the way you go about work, it will be very difficult to get group level success, right? So it places attention on the organization, on what role it should play, and it actually argues to conceptualize our organizational variables beyond just simple control, right? No one in this room does this. But these institutional variables can be far more than just controls, right? That they tell us some important outcomes as well. And then from a practice standpoint, it does beg the question of taking on the difficult work of understanding how we are structured as organizations, how does decision making occur, and in what ways do we have an environment that seeks diverse individuals or diverse thinking, but does not elect to change any of its value structure, but only that those that desire to become a part of it must change to fit. And so we'll continue to have some disconnect in places as well there. All right, I'll stop there. I think I still got time left. Yes.
I think I have a comment in the form of a question. But first, thank you very much for provoking a lot of thinking with me about topics I don't often think about, one of which is higher education. So, is it the case, if you looked within universities, let's say large universities, that certain schools, for example, education, have made more progress than others? And if that is the case, do you think it's connected in any way with the political discourse in the country about doing away with the Department of Education?
That's a very good question, and I get a similar question because a good bit of my time is spent doing work with the National Science Foundation, and they certainly have a broadening participation focus and quite interested in increasing the diversity there. And they tend to point to the fact that the percentage-wise, there's more diversity in the field of education, right? But then if you look at it, education's not that diverse. I mean, if you think about, although there's larger numbers, it's still not that diverse. It just means that in other fields, we could put everybody in the same room. So for 10 years, I've been studying black computer scientists. We can get all of them right in this room. I mean, literally, black computer scientists with PhDs could all fit in this room, and the first person is still living. Right? So it just simply means it is very stark when you start thinking about other disciplines. I mean, and the computer science is the one that I know the most, but there's a lot of places that we could be contributing intellectually that just aren't being introduced to young people early enough in life that they find themselves wanting to be a computer science or going to epidemiology or any of these other types of areas. But everybody has some level of contact with education, and it's not that large of a stretch to see yourself in that space. And for many diverse populations, it was among the first fields that you could even do, right? So it is a part of the lexicon. But I think to your question, we aren't doing that well in education, right? If you think about the level of diversity that you see among the faculty in most places, we still struggle, I think, in education. So.
You began your talk with a very provocative juxtaposition of the football teams at the beginning of the 20th century and today. And obviously, football is an area of higher education that many people take very seriously, and as your picture showed, it's an area of higher education that was once all white, and now it's, I don't know the exact racial makeup of our football teams, but certainly there is a high number of African Americans. And since you're talking about like organizational change, I know that football is a special part of higher education, but still it's a valued part of higher education. I'm wondering, are there any lessons in that dramatic change to changing other aspects of higher education and organizations in regard to race?
Absolutely, right? So if you think about athletics as another unit that has leadership and there's decision making going on, right? So those coaches are recruiting, right? And that world is a little different than some of the other worlds in that you win or you lose. And right or wrong, a lot of decisions are made on winning or losing. And if you lose enough, And then you recognize that if I need to, in order for me to compete at the highest level, I have to do things differently. Change comes a little quicker in a space like that. And so what I think we can take away is that if the idea is that your analog between diversity and competing at the higher level is complementary, you can achieve different goals. If your idea is that to diversify is to mean that quality is less, or you are not competing for the very best, it creates what you see in a lot of places, that it feels like the discussions are around, in order for me to do this, I have to give up something like this. But in that space, in order to continue to compete, they found that it was quite necessary to get rid of some artificial barriers that had been in place for quite some time, because it was never a known fact that the best athletes were not of varying, colors. It was, or race, ethnicity. It was just you couldn't compete against each other, and these were the reasons why. So it was all artificial.
So if I just ask a follow-up, then that implies that there has to be a metric that is counted as a metric of excellence. In football, it was the winning these games, but that our current metrics of excellence aren't sensitive in that they don't, they wouldn't reflect the type of excellence achieved by having a racially diverse faculty and student body. So are there metrics that you would recommend that institutions focus on in order to be able to show that, oh yes, there is a real winning that we want to do, that we only can do by the 2021st?
So I would send that person to the website and all the research, that social science research that Michigan did for the Gratz and Grutter case, the one that was successful in the Supreme Court, arguing the benefits of diversity, and that the increased learning and outcomes in the classroom that was appreciably more beneficial to the non-diverse students, right? So there is work out there that helps us to think about the varying metrics, right? What makes it a little more difficult is a W and an L doesn't translate as easily to learning in a classroom, interpersonal skills, and but we could certainly find ways to think about what are desirable outcomes we would like for all our students and faculty and staff to have, and look across those metrics. 'Cause we won't have one, right? But there are a number that there's good information on already, and I'd say that work on the social science work and those Michigan cases are very helpful. And it was not presented in a way that you give up quality to have diversity, but argued that the diversity is a part of the quality education.
Just wanted to go on Julie's point back to the sports piece. So I look at that picture and it makes me think about it's essentially merit. It's just non-academic merit. But other research has shown is that if you try to just have a meritocratic approach within academia, that actually leads to less diversity and equality. So when you talk about social closure theory, what I actually thought you were sort of getting at is almost a sense of like hard affirmative action. And we need to provide a level of preferential treatment to, say, increase the number of people of color who are in administrative positions. If that is what one solution, how do you pursue that type of policy or goal within today's current context, where to provide preferential treatment to one group is looked at through the courts and just through society as being a very effective?
Right. So how you change your organization certainly is not a simple task, and one of the ways in which you can reasonably do this is ensure that you have informed decision makers in the room, right? So a part of the work that I'm working on now is in this decision making space, because when you just kind of think about this process from a widget, accruable asset perspective, what gets left out of this is the human element of assigning value to merit, right? So merit is whatever you assign, right? And so what's interesting about that is, under any condition, depending on who's in the room, I can provide no credit for that single authored top tier journal that you put in the very best journal by simply saying, we already knew that information, so there's no real contribution, right? So it's getting down to the discourse and what is actually occurring between a person's experiences, their outcomes, their work, and the observable realities. And that's where this hard work is going to be. Is it achievable by diversifying those all a part of the process? Is it achievable through the educational process to understand something as simple as GRE scores may not predict performance for certain groups? I mean, I think that's, for some, that's still a debate. How important is that test on your capability to contribute to important knowledge? I mean, so we have a lot of barriers still in place that are organizationally relevant that we could make some decisions about. You know, just think about the GRE. Think about the millions of dollars to continue to use something that maybe is debatable on what it predicts, to create programs just to prepare students to do better on it. Like, think of all the money that you put into helping students to do better on a test that you have questions about. Is that the best placement of those resources? Or is that just to protect how organizations are currently making decisions and ensure that those that will do well on this test will always have an opportunity in these organizations, right? So I mean, I think it comes down to a lot of tough questions. I mean, this is not, we're at a time where these are some lot of tough questions that are going to be on all your desks to solve for the rest of us, because I mean, we have some entrenched behaviors and decisions that impact and continue to support how we are operationalizing higher education.
And with that, please join me in thanking Jerlando.
Thank you.